You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
A very good Wednesday to you all. I hope everyone is well and enjoying August. Thank you for joining us here tonight on Parasearch Radio for some more Haunted Histories with me, your hostess with the mostess, Penny G. Morgan. Last week we talked with Rosie and Stuart Dawson of Simply Ghost Nights about St Catherine's Asylum in Doncaster, and we also went through a very sort of potted history of mental health treatment here in the UK. Well, after the show, I was messaged by Cassie, who is one of the Simply Ghost Night staff, about some of her experience at St Cath's, as it's affectionately known by those in the know. The first thing she said was, "Great show tonight, really enjoyed it." So thank you for that one, Cassie, it's much appreciated. Then she went on to tell me that, she said, "I'm a team leader with Simply Ghost Nights, so have spent a lot of time with the Dawsons, and absolutely loads at St Cath's. The apparition I saw was on the main staircase. I was with a group on the landing. The group was round the table, and I was stood on one side, and another team leader was on the other side. At the same time, both of us moved towards the stairs, as we saw a man walking up the steps, and we were going to question what he was doing wandering about. We got to the banister, but there was no one there. I would have questioned that I was seeing things if only I had seen it. If only she had seen it. But someone else did too, which made it more real. In one of the other rooms, I don't know if you remember the show, but we talked about the fact that the rooms are known by almost like colours because of the colour of the carpets or whatever in them. But one of them's called the Red Room. And Cassie goes on to say that in the Red Room, they often get a character who pretends to be other people, though you can tell it's him by the movement of the glass. If any guests guess a name, he'll just say yes and make up an entire story. Then you ask if he's having you on, and he'll say yes. She said they've had whole vigils of his fibs, which are quite funny. She also said that often soldiers come through at St Cath's, as it was used for a recuperation centre at one point, and that children are incredibly common in the kitchen area. She said you can feel your back pocket being tugged, or it almost feels as though someone is wrapping their arms around your thigh as if they were a small child. What amazing experiences. And that's only a few of them. Cassie said she has loads of stories about things that she's experienced, in this place. So it definitely sounds to me like St Cath's in Doncaster with Simply Ghost Nights. It's the place to go if you're in the area. So do contact them if it's something you'd like to do. So, tonight, where are we going? Well, this amazing place is a little bit south of Doncaster, although still quite north of me here in Essex, and it's somewhere called Drakelow Tunnels, which is near Kidderminster in Worcestershire. It may be somewhere that you've heard of, especially if you're either a history buff or have watched Most Haunted in the past, as they have visited there. Cannot say I agree with their view of the place about being an underground hell or something like that, but you can watch that episode online and get a good view of the place, all 3.5 miles of its tunnels, or 284,931 square feet of it. And no, that isn't a typo. The surface area covers over 28 rugby pitches. You may have noticed I said rugby pitches and not the more common football pitches, which people do seem to normally use for comparison purposes. There's a reason for that. A very simple one. I can't stand football. I'm a rugby girl. Never forget that. Anyway, we're going to be looking at some of the history surrounding Drakelow, what the different evolutions that it's gone through. And I thought it would fit quite nicely into a short segment on World War II bomber groups, as the original reason for the building of Drakelow Tunnels was as a shadow factory for Rover, who had started to construct aeroplane parts at the beginning of the war. Primarily parts for Bristol Hercules engines and Rolls-Royce Merlins, who powered some of the most famous aircraft associated, and remain to be associated, with the Second World War. But let's go back to the beginning. Why was Drakelow constructed? Now, do you remember on the show back in July, I think it was, on Coventry, when we talked with Dee Mason of Goth Angel Productions about the bombing campaign in November of 1940, where the city of Coventry suffered, well, it had its own blitz, basically. Well, one of the factories that was pretty much obliterated was the St Helens Rover plant. Rover and the aircraft business couldn't suffer another blow like this, so the idea to disperse factories so that one being hit hard would not halt production to that effect came into being. Rover continued to expand its operations, and by 1942 operated 18 factories, 6 of which were called shadow factories, which were owned by the government. Its own workforce of just under 4,000 staff were complemented by an additional 20,000 members of staff employed in the shadow and dispersal factories and contracted work for the Air Ministry. It was partly due to this, and also the realisation that maybe if a factory was underground, it could not be destroyed, that a complex below ground was devised. It never really saw use as a factory, as its completion, after many, many hours of construction and engineering headaches, was after the war was really winding down. So it ended up being used to produce parts for tanks after the war finished until 1961. At that point, it was requisitioned as a regional seat of government in the event of nuclear war, and blast doors and air vents were installed into part of it so that it could have official nuclear bunker status. It wasn't actually until 1993 that the tunnels were decommissioned and sold. Have a listen to our show on Kelvin and Hatch if you want to learn more about the whole nuclear bunker, nuclear shelter sort of situation and why they were constructed and how. We're going to talk about the paranormal activity which has taken place there, both first-hand accounts, in other words, I've been there, I've investigated there, I've had my own experiences, and also recorded reports, and also some of the accidents and incidents which have taken place, which may give rise to some of these. But we shall leave those until after the break, as I have plenty to talk about now, as you can probably imagine. So, looking at the 1940s, I mentioned that Rover built parts for Bristol Hercules and Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Well, the former, the Bristol Hercules, were used in aircraft such as the Short Stirling and the Handley Page Halifax. A plane like the Stirling was a 4-engined monoplane heavy bomber. Monoplane basically meaning a single fixed-wing aircraft. So I can't get my words out. And this had a crew of 7. It was reported to be an absolute delight to fly, but as with a lot of tail bombers, such as the Halifax and Lancaster, which we will come on to, tail bombers being those that when they were on the ground, if you have a look at one, the tail was a lot lower than the nose. In other words, it had a small wheel on the tail, and when you landed it, you wanted to bring the tail down as opposed to landing it level, like you would see with commercial aircraft now for such like. Anyway, it was meant to be a bit of a pig to take off and land. On landing it had a habit of stalling when you started what's called the landing flare procedure, which is pretty much just before you touch down, and you raise the nose of the aircraft slightly, slowing the descent rate and setting your altitude. The Stirling would stall and pretty much drop like a stone. Not very good for the aircraft, the crew, or indeed pretty much anything in the immediate vicinity. On takeoff, proper takeoff technique involved feeding in the right engine throttle during the initial 20 seconds of the takeoff run until the rudder became effective for control. If all 4 throttles were advanced simultaneously, which you see with a lot of aircraft, the aircraft would swing to the right, become uncontrollable, and often collapse the landing gear, which could be absolutely disastrous, as I'm sure you can imagine, if the aircraft was loaded with bombs and fuel. But regardless of her foibles, she was still a very well-used aircraft during World War II. The Halifax had an 8-man crew, 7 or 8 to be perfectly honest, and was also a heavy bomber. But for most, the most famous bomber aircraft of the war, from a British perspective anyway, was the Avro Lancaster, which was powered by those beautiful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. As were 2, probably of the most well-known British aircraft possibly ever built, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. But I feel that the exploits of those glamorous fighter planes has been looked at so many times, and I think I want to focus more on the side of Bomber Command, the much maligned division of the RAF, who were held accountable unfairly, if you ask me, for random destruction, and only relatively recently, in my view, received the honour which those brave crews deserved by the unveiling of the Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park, London. This was only unveiled in 2012 and was a memorial to the over 55,000 crew who perished during the Second World War. The Lancaster was, and still remains, possibly one of my favourite aircraft of all time. Yes, I know I sound like a total geek, and many of you are probably wondering, what on earth possesses me to wax lyrical about these old aeroplanes? Well, apart from the sound of those 4 engines as they pass overhead, if you've never been under a Lang flying at about 2,000 feet or less, you won't know the feeling of your stomach as it rumbles through your toes. But also the beauty and elegance of such an old girl with 70 plus years of history at her toes. Look at one of those aircraft and picture 75 years ago when she was laden with bombs, had a crew of 7 who weren't expected to survive more than 2 weeks of sorties. Yes, that's right, 2 weeks. They had a life expectancy of 2 weeks. The average age of a Lanc crew was 22. 22 years old. I've clothes older than that, and I've certainly got shoes older than that. And these men, no, I'm not being sexist, were in these flying coffins, as some of them coined them, albeit very aesthetically beautiful coffins, risking their lives every single day, and it was classed as being one of the most dangerous places to be in the whole war. The only thing that was seen to be more dangerous was submarines chasing U-boats. You may scoff at this, but if you ever get the chance to climb into one of these old heavy bombers, you will see that the positioning of the escape hatches on one of these old war horses meant that certain members of the crew would find it easier to escape than others. It was quite cramped in there. The pilot and co-pilot, come flight engineer, probably were the most likely to survive, but this may have been due to them being the hardest to replace, as their training was the longest. To give you an idea, though, as to how short the training could be to get your wings in World War II, 6 months or 150 flying hours was possible, although normally it was nearer 200 hours before you were then sent for combat flight training. Still ridiculously short, but the RAF was desperate for pilots. If you look at modern day, just to get your private pilot's licence, it's on average 60 to 70 hours, and that's just to fly a single prop light aircraft. Not nearly as responsible as flying a 4-engined heavy bomber. So we've ascertained that bomber crews were ridiculously young, and that the bombers such as the Lancasters were basically flying coffins, with the average lifetime of crew being around 2 weeks. But it's the treatment of these men and the lack of acknowledgement to them, and Sir Arthur Travis Harris, also known as Bomber Harris, who was in charge of Bomber Command, that I find strange, and feel the need to talk about what they went through. There's a brilliant book by the the writer, I believe he was a former war correspondent. He's done quite a few World War II history books, called Patrick, whose name, is Patrick Bishop. And this book's called Bomber Boys. And I've borrowed from it quite heavily whilst writing this. He mentions that Bomber Command lost 4,823 men and 2,331 aircraft on operations in the first 2 years of the war, and they had very little to show for it. In that time, they had dropped only just over 35,000 tons of bombs. I say only because 35,000 tons sounds quite a lot, but because something in the region of 3.4 million tons were dropped on Axis forces by Allies in the whole of the World War II. In one of the earlier missions to Frankfurt in August of 1941, there resulted the loss of 16 lives, and this was actually 2 British for every 1 German killed, and not to mention the 7 aircraft lost out of a total of 140. This kind of inept use of bombers and men's lives, to be quite honest, didn't last, and Harris changed the method of bombing. So rather than drip feeding the bombers in a couple at a time to various different targets, he focused on concentration. And although this larger number of aircraft attacking only one target at the time increased the chances of collisions between aeroplanes, which certainly happened, it also reduced the time that the flak gunners had the bombers in their sights, and would make it a lot harder for them to pick off individual planes. He also looked at overwhelming the German emergency services, so they didn't have time to react and were caught out by the sheer weight of violence. One of his favourite methods being using incendiary devices. This does seem quite harsh, really, but it still did not have the same effect on loss of life that the German bombing of London had had in May of 1941, and those initial attacks were on places called Lübeck and Rostock. The first big raid was to Cologne in May of 1942. This was Germany's 3rd largest city, so quite a tall order for the crews being dispatched, which were actually 7 times the number that had been sent out there only 2 months previously. In total, 1,047 aircraft took part in the raid, carrying nearly 1,500 tons of bombs, 66% of which were incendiary devices. This, just over 1,000 of aircraft, included the Lancasters, which were actually then new to Bomber Command. I think there was about 70 of them included in that number. The devastation to Cologne, although not quite the fires that had raged through Lübeck and Rostock, which burnt quite severely, was still high. Over 3,000 buildings were destroyed, with a further 9,000 damaged to some degree. 13,000 homes were obliterated, hospitals, churches, schools, and 4 university buildings blasted or burned down. This was unprecedented, as these were quite obviously not the military targets that people have been used to having attacked, and they also killed 469 people. Only around 10% of those were military. So they were killing civilians, which was not the normal game plan of bombing. However, this was no different, in all honesty, to what Germany had done to Coventry 18 months earlier. So, why did people tend to talk about Bomber Command in such hushed and sort of, let's brush it under the carpet tones? Was this area bombing, purely the idea of Bomber Harris, or Butcher Harris as he was also known, or was he merely the fall guy for instructions from above? I believe the latter to be true. The campaign of destruction rained down on German towns and cities by the bombing offensive was at the behest of the War Cabinet, and Churchill, seemingly ignoring this at the end of the war, was a very bitter pill to swallow for the proud Harris. Yes, campaigns like Hamburg, the Battle of Berlin and Dresden had high civilian death tolls, and although this was part of the process of destroying Germany and bringing the Nazis to their knees, some people felt that killing women and children was a step too far, because of course none of the bombs falling in the UK ever killed women or children. At all. Ever. Spot the sarcasm. But if you look into the air attacks on Dresden, this wasn't just picked at random. It was actually to aid the Russian allies, whose front was around 100 miles to the east. The attack did create a firestorm which engulfed the entire city. A lot of people back home, sitting safely in their front rooms, felt that this was gratuitous killing, especially when the end was in sight. But that's the beauty of hindsight. No one really knew that the end was in sight, and there was no indication that the Axis forces wouldn't fight on to their last breath. And in fact, a lot of the demonisation of Bomber Command has come after the war has finished and people have read up on the events and such like. But if you weren't there, you didn't know, is my view. But these crews didn't just use their aircraft for death and destruction. Operation Manna had Lanks flying nearly 3,000 sorties, dropping around 7,000 tons of food into an area of Western Holland which was still under occupation. At the end of the war, Churchill seemed to forget the sacrifice of Bomber Command. His Victory in Europe speech mentioned both the Royal and Merchant Navy and the things that they had done. The Army praised glorious praise, and he eulogised Fighter Command and its Battle of Britain victory, even mentioning Dowding by name, but nothing for Bomber Command. Not even a medal for the services and missions that they undertook. All the Bomber Command qualified for was the Defence Medal, as they were flying from home, and therefore they were defending as opposed to offence movements. Harris was furious at this, and told the War Cabinet this in no uncertain terms, and in fact I think his nose was put out of joint a bit because he thought Churchill was a close friend of his, and he felt very, very let down, and actually refused to accept any kind of accolade whatsoever. He did backtrack on that slightly and accept a peerage, but those bomber crews never got their own mission medals like the other sort of forces, if you like, who fought in World War II. Pretty raw and unfair treatment, if you ask me, just because the missions they flew were to be brushed under the carpet as not being British enough, and the fact they weren't just they were just attacking places at the request of the powers that be. Anyway, that's enough of that for now. When we come back, we'll be looking in more depth at Drakelow Tunnels and some of the paranormal events that I've experienced personally, and also those that have been described by other people. Stay tuned, only be a little while.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And we're back. Thank you for joining me again on this Wednesday evening talking about Drakelow Tunnels in near Kidderminster. Now, hope you've had your coffee or your beer or whatever takes your fancy, ready for part 2 of this trip. Now, hopefully you have seen or you can work out why I chose to talk about Bomber Command when Drakelow was so built basically to build these engines for these aircraft and bomber crews that I mentioned in the first part. Drakelow is a shadow factory, which is quite an ironic term when you think about the amount of paranormal experiences that have been heard there. They help build these parts needed for the engines. But the stories behind the tunnels are probably interesting in their own right, and it hasn't had the best of luck when it comes to fatalities. When you walk into the tunnel, it almost looks, when you approach it, it looks like a road tunnel that's been bricked up. It's the only way I can describe it, with a metal door in the side. It's not something you would have found by accident, a bit like Kelvin and Hatch in that respect, because Kelvin and Hatch you wouldn't just stumble across by accident. And as you walk in through the door, there's a beautiful old clock, rusting and sort of antique and a bit decrepit, hanging from the ceiling. You just think that would have been what you saw as you were walking into the tunnel just before they locked the doors down. You also walk into a consistent temperature of about 10 degrees or so. never really varies. It's very cold. When I went there last September, it was about 30 odd degrees outside when we walked in. Yeah, still only about 10 degrees inside. Doesn't warm up. So if you ever do get to go there, regardless of what the weather's doing outside, take your warm clothes with you, because you will be cold. I mentioned there was no electricity on. Nope. No lights. Nothing. All we had were torches and candles. Made for a very eerie and interesting evening, I must admit. So there was nothing there to interfere with any of the equipment, the paranormal equipment we chose to bring. It really is a maze of tunnels. And if you want to have a look at how big this place is without actually going there, although I would recommend going there if you can, go and have a look on the Drakelow Tunnels website, because they show a map of all the tunnels and which bits are the original 1940s and which bits were actually constructed for the regional headquarters, the nuclear part. But some are simply a loop. Some you can loop round and you come back to other bits. Other bits are a dead end. Other bits lead into little rooms which you can get lost very easily. None of the radios work down there. It was too deep underground. Your mobile phone certainly won't work. So if you get lost, you've got to hope that someone knows where you were going and they'll come and find you. But there's no lighting. It's underground. There's no natural light either. It's underground. So a torch is probably your best friend, and some spare batteries in your pocket just in case. It was actually during the construction of Drakelow Tunnels in sort of 1941, 1942 that several, tragic accidents occurred, resulting in the deaths of 7 people. Now, when you look this up, when you do the research, they always make a point of saying 6 men and 1 woman. I don't see the point of differentiating that. It was 7 people. 7 people died. The first and possibly the most traumatic series of deaths occurred on the 31st of October 1941 as a roof collapsed in Tunnel 1, and this is actually documented in Rover's archives if you want to look it up. Whilst they were blasting out the space for Tunnel 1, the roof suddenly caved in without warning, and a Mr. Harry Depper and 2 of his colleagues who were working in the tunnel were eventually crushed to death by falling rock. Mr. Depper actually died on site and is buried in a local cemetery, or was buried, in a local cemetery 5 days later. His 2 colleagues died very shortly afterwards in hospital, and there was a 4th that wasn't expected to make it. But there's no account that he did actually die, so it looks like he survived. But that was 3 people killed from a tunnel collapse whilst they were blowing the space out. The 4th death shortly after that was of a Mrs. Mary Ann Brettle, who was accidentally hit by one of the John Cochrane and Sons dump trucks whilst outside the complex. She died subsequently of shock a little bit later. The last 3 deaths at Drakelow were unfortunately down to just possibly sheer bad luck. I'm not sure. 2 of them, whether it was bad luck, whether it was exhaustion, nobody will ever know. But to make excavation of the tunnels more effective, conveyor belts were installed to remove the loose rock that was caused by blasting. Very common building practice, using conveyor belts to ease up the workload and to mean that more whatever can be shifted. After a hard day of working the tunnels, 2 of the construction workers decided to ride on top of the conveyor. Before they reached the end, they had become entangled in the machinery, which mangled them to death. What a horrible way to go. Horrible. The last known death to occur at Drakelow was that of a Mr. Eric Harold Newman. Now, Mr. Newman was the security officer for the goods in and out part, and whilst leaving the complex one evening on his motorbike, he was accidentally struck down by a Mr. Wilkes, the coach driver, who used to bring in the workers each day to Drakelow. Now, you think that might sound a bit nice, a coach bringing workers in, but honestly, it's in the middle of nowhere. They probably wouldn't have got there without it. As with a lot of former Ministry of Defence sites, the actual work and events which were undertaken here still remain shrouded in mystery due to the Official Secrets Act. But former workers have been contacted by the current owners of Drakelow to establish a kind of timeline And they've also been able to obtain tales of the paranormal and also explanations of some of the events which have occurred at Drakelow, fortunately. But there's still an awful lot left to be told, I suppose you could say. So, when I was there last September, one of the other investigators and I were running a digital recorder in one of the side rooms. And we were asking questions like, did you work here? What's your name? You know, the normal kind of thing that investigators ask. And not only did I feel like someone was leaning on my back, I felt a sort of a weight on my back. I also felt like someone was trying to pull me in different directions. The investigator I was with was quite experienced, and he said, I want to get you away from this room because I'm feeling something's trying to attach itself to you, and we don't really want that. But when we played the recorder back, we heard, it was almost like 1940s music in the background of the recording. Now, it could have just been our interpretation of the noise that we heard, almost like a sort of an audio version of pareidolia. I don't know. May bear in mind that it was pitch black in there. There was very little other noise because it's quite well noise-proofed in other rooms. And I would have possibly entertained the fact that it was something sort of that we'd made up in our own minds if it wasn't for this next story that I found. One evening in late 1993, the caretaker of the property was inspecting the kitchen in the old RSG side of the complex, when he began to hear faint 1940s music. It seemed to be coming from the old Rover Shadow factory side, and thinking it might possibly be a maintenance engineer who had left his radio on, this intrepid caretaker went to investigate. As he approached Tunnel 1, the music began to get louder. But as he stepped out into the tunnel itself, the music just stopped. He walked the length of the tunnel to see if he could find the radio, or the reason for this music playing, but found nothing. Upon reaching what would have been the old-time office at the end of Tunnel 1, which you can still see if you go there, the music started again. So the caretaker walked back down the tunnel, still found nothing. Now the caretaker, determined to find the mysterious radio, the mysterious source of this noise, continued his search, and this quick sort of shutdown inspection turned into 6 hours worth of exploring and searching the entire complex, but no music source or radio was found. The only piece of equipment that would have been capable of playing music to that extent was the old World War II tannoy system, and that hadn't worked since the 1950s. Now, in my experience, when we got that on our digital recorder, you may think someone could have been there in the background playing the music. But I can definitely say the tannoy system was not working. It was disconnected. There was no electricity. And there was no music we could hear with our ears. So, where did it come from? How did the digital recorder pick it up? And how did people, and these aren't the only examples of people hearing this 1940s music, it's meant to be quite a common phenomena at the tunnels. Another experience I had there was in the old kitchens. Now, I love a bit of old stuff. You know it, you listen to my show, you know I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to old stuff. Now, these kitchens have still got a lot of the original equipment from when it would have been a functional kitchen. How far back I don't know, but definitely for the last 30-40 years. And by functional equipment I mean it's got the old hobs that they would have used for cooking on. It's got those big, almost like silver cauldron type things that you see them on, I don't know, almost like prison shows with the big spatula stirring the food in. And we had a laser grid set up on the far wall. And my colleague and I started seeing the lights intermittently being blocked out, as though somebody was moving around up there, almost hiding in the corner. We went over there to see what was going on, to see if there was something that could have been blocking the lights out, and we found there was a room behind it. We went in there, and went in there with a temperature reader. On command, whatever was there raised the temperature for me, and then brought it back down again. Not by a massive amount, but it was definitely on command as it happened. But what was even more interesting was the smoke that appeared in front of my torch. It seemed to be sort of curling and spiralling in front of the torch, almost like someone was smoking a cigarette behind me and was blowing the smoke from under my torch. Now, I believe, but I'm also a cynic, and I'm also an investigator. So we both held our breath to see if it was sort of condensation, or the sort of the smoky stuff that comes out when you're cold. Can't think of what the technical term is. I'm sorry, but it still happened. You still kept seeing this cigarette smoke in front of my torch, and you can't smoke in the tunnels. It's not allowed. So who was it? Was it a former worker on a break, coming to have a look? Sitting there outside the kitchens having a cigarette? Dunno. There's been a lot of reports of dog prints being seen in the floor and then disappearing. Can't say I've saw them, but I know there are accounts of the owner seeing them when he's gone in the following day to open up to do maintenance work. And that was what started him bringing his own dog to work, in case there were loose dogs there. But none have ever been found, and there was no other traces apart from these strange footprints. Dogs and animals, as most of us know, are quite perceptive of subtle changes to places, subtle changes in the energy. And this story really proves that too. On to my next strange event. Not one that I've experienced, sadly, but it's documented. Late one evening, in the winter of 1996, when he was on his usual locking down rounds, the resident caretaker and his 2 German Shepherd dogs were locking the complex down after a work party they had been in during the day, repairing some wiring or such like. All was as usual until they reached the regional government headquarters part of the nuclear part again. The caretaker was securing the GPO telephone exchange whilst his dogs wandered into the next room. Suddenly they began barking frantically, as if an intruder had been discovered. The caretaker quickly rushed in to see what was happening, and to his surprise, there was absolutely no one to be seen. The dogs were sat, staring fixated on the wall and barking manically. The caretaker eventually calmed them down and put them on their leads and continued with his rounds. As they stepped into Tunnel 4, the dogs stopped dead in their tracks and began growling. The caretaker bent down in an attempt to calm them once more, but to this time to no avail. They ignored him completely. They stood transfixed on something at the top of the tunnel. Following their gaze, the caretaker focused on what the dogs were actually looking at, but could not see anything. As he stood back up, the dogs fell silent, and the caretaker glanced up and couldn't believe his eyes. There was a mist now present at the top of Tunnel 4, and it was slowly floating towards him. At this point, the dogs broke free and fled back through the regional government headquarters. The caretaker quickly followed his dogs, thinking that there may be a fire or something outside of Tunnel 4. When he finally caught up with them, they were barking and desperately scratching at the blast door to get out. He opened the doors and the dogs ran to the car outside. Locking the door, the caretaker then jumped into his car and sped round to the entrance of Tunnel 4 to see how bad this fire was that was causing this mist. When he arrived, albeit a mere few minutes later, he could not believe what he saw. There was nothing. There was no fire, no mist. Confused, he drove back round to the Tunnel A entrance. He got out of his car and beckoned the dogs, but they were not moving from that car. They were staying put. The caretaker reopened the blast doors and made his way back to Tunnel 4, expecting the worst. He took a fire extinguisher with him, but as he stepped out into the tunnel, there was nothing there. There was no fire, no mist, nothing. Just an empty tunnel. The caretaker returned with his dogs a few days later to work, but as soon as they approached the entrance, the dogs began whimpering and just refused to go in. I wonder what had scared them. Wonder what they'd sensed. Wonder what they'd seen. Another experience I had there was in what they call the X-ray room. Now keep in mind that especially when this place was converted into a nuclear shelter, it had full medical facilities, as did they all. Kelvin and Hatch being no different. And in fact, the actual medical room, we did pick up a few noises which we were unable to debunk on our digital recorders. The group who was showing us round, and you do need guides when you go there, guys, because it's very complicated and it's very easy to get lost, mentioned that a lot of people had had weird experiences in this particular part, this X-ray room. And we were no different. One of their team went into what I would call a trance-like state. Now, whether you believe that trance work is true or not is 100% your choice, and it's your choice alone. I'm not going to question you. But all I can say is it seemed pretty real to me at the time, especially when they were getting worried about him and wanted to get him out of the room, and there was about 5 or 6 grown men trying to move one bloke, and they couldn't shift him. It was like he was fixed to the floor. Anyway, this gentleman was getting quite upset by some entity in the room who had what he described as a devil dog, or a familiar, with her. But the thing that caught me was the fact that one of the guests got very angry when we wouldn't let him investigate this person who was having the trance. Now, what was interesting about that is, although this guest had been very inquisitive on the whole tour, when we had asked him to maybe keep quiet or maybe join in the sort of the questions and stuff, he hadn't got angry with us. He hadn't got confrontational. He seemed quite laid back. But when we wouldn't let him investigate, there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of confrontation. It was like it was a different person. Now, what was intriguing about that, somebody could have just lost their temper, but what was intriguing was one of the male members of the team, who was possibly one of the most laid back and gentle people I'd ever met, started getting very... He said he just had anger coursing through him as he approached this room, and he didn't want to go in. In fact, he asked not to go in. Now, he didn't know its backstory, and he said he felt unpredictable, and he really didn't know what he was going to do. But once he stepped away from there, the anger dissipated. It's interesting, isn't it? What was going on in that room, and it only seemed to affect men, doesn't seem to affect women. Now, I asked the group whose member had gone into the trance what was going on, and they said it happens very frequently. And what they've managed to glean from this chap is that it's a woman who they think might have been a witch or something, but not a good witch, not a Glenda, but more of a wicked witch. And this dog, beast, wolf thing is indeed her familiar, and she doesn't like men. Doesn't want them in there, doesn't want them in this part of the tunnel, which is her domain as far as she's concerned. So, when I started looking into the place after I'd done this visit, and I can honestly say I was intrigued, I found out that Drake, the Drake part of Drakelow, comes from the Old English word Draka, which means dragon. And the tunnels themselves have a history of occult practice. It was not uncommon for whoever the caretaker was to come in and find satanic symbols drawn into the floor and walls, and occult symbols, and evidence of rituals having been undertaken. Interestingly enough, when I looked into it even further, there's also a belief that the hills, which Drakelow is built under in Kingsford Country Park, were used at some point as either a coven or a pagan meeting place for many, many years. One of the other things I discovered when looking into it, that some research even suggested that this had been a burial site, a sacred burial site at some point, and by disturbing the bones, the bad luck was unleashed. And with 7 people dying in the first few years of it being constructed, that's definitely bad luck. Now, perhaps this is why the guide who went into a trance reported seeing a devil-type dog as this witch's familiar. Maybe it was something that had been conjured up by people who have been messing around with the occult there. Or maybe it is something darker and more genuine. Other people have reported seeing red eyes in the dark when they've been there, including one of the groups that were with us. I wasn't there at the time, and I believe it was in the key room, but a couple of them said they saw red eyes looking at them from underneath the benches. Now, are these just the mind playing tricks and making us see what we think we want to see? Or has something much darker been disturbed and continues to lurk? I guess we'll never know, sadly. Now, talking of tales of people who have seen things there, I did actually find an article from last December in the Daily Fail, or Daily Mail as most people call it. And it was this chap called Anthony Mark, who had done an investigation there with his paranormal group and had decided to wander off on his own. Silly boy. And had got lost. But being the intrepid paranormal investigator that he was, he had his spirit box going. And he also had a camera going and was using the illumination from the camera to try and find his way back. When he reviewed his footage, he saw what he says was a face manifesting behind him on his camera. He estimates that from where the face was in relation to him, the person would have been about 5'6", and he thought he saw horns. Supposedly, he also asked, "Are you still here?" And the voice replied back, "By you," as this face appeared. Don't know, it could have just been some kind of reflection off the walls, and again, pareidolia. But with a place that is reputed to have as much paranormal action as it does there, it could be true. Google it, see what you think, let me know. What I can definitely say about Drakelow is that it is a fascinating place. It's well worth a visit, whether you go as a history buff or whether you try and get on a paranormal tour there. If you do, whichever you do, take my word for it, it's cold. Wrap up. And if the Ministry of Defence records of any unexplained occurrences there are ever made public, I think they would probably make for quite interesting reading. Don't you? So, there endeth our chat on Drakelow Tunnels. Do tell me what you think if you've been there, and I'll make sure I mention it next week. But next on Parasearch, we have our own Dark Mirror crew on Friday who have left our colleague and friend, poor Kaz Rooney, on her lonesome at 30 East Drive, the infamous 30 East Drive, just so you guys can have a good show. Dedication for you. Friday, 9 o'clock, here on Parasearch Radio. Don't miss it. Even if just to wish Kaz well and to make sure that nothing nasty has happened to her up at 30 East Drive. Next week, I'll be looking at the Battle of Gettysburg and whether there are any residual spirits still fighting there. It'll be an education for me because I'll admit I don't know much about American history. So anyone who knows me will probably be able to picture the big anticipatory grin that's on my face as I get ready to start researching Gettysburg and the history of all those type of things in America. I will be aided and abetted by an American expert called Cheryl, who I'll be introducing you to next week. But please don't forget, shows on every night for your paranormal delight, here only on Parasearch Radio. All that leaves me to say is thank you for listening, good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.